Okay, I'm ready. I'm good. All right, let's go. Namaste. All right, so do I have my microphone on? That would be the other test. I have two microphones on. That's going to sound weird. Okay, now it's better. Okay, so we left off last time. So we're talking about families in what is an increasingly long unit, somewhat unintentionally. And we came to this piece, which is linked on Canvas. My pen is no worky. My whole PowerPoint is no worky. Oh dear. This happens sometimes. All right. I will fix-ish. I broke everything. That's what happened. Is it that I have 40 tabs open in Edge, maybe? Okay. And task for PowerPoint. Okay, perfect. All right, I'll try this again. That's going well. It's thrilling television, let me tell you. Not responding. Oh, I noticed. All right, let's close everything else and see if we can. So what happens? You do too many things. Your computer fails. PowerPoint couldn't start last time. I do not want to start safe mode. That's not going to turn out well. Okay. So far, so good. Okay, let's try this again. Oh, and OBS is good. All right. No. Yes. Okay. Okay, I can go forward and backwards again. All right. So, sorry about that. Technical difficulties and all. Yeah, we're gonna keep talking about this piece that I was talking about last time from Johann Kurtz, talking about the title of the piece is "It's Embarrassing to Be a Stay-at-Home Mom," and he goes through some interesting kind of arguments and data. And when I heard him speak on a podcast, and then I went and found the piece, it was provocative and it got me thinking. So I thought, why not present that to all of you? Okay. So I guess we ended off with this slide last time, right? Which basically, sorry, technical difficulties in my brain too. So we know that fertility is declining globally with a few exceptions, right? And these exceptions being places like sub-Saharan Africa, and in some places where fertility collapses, it collapses really, really quickly. And we have a bunch of explanations that have been offered for this, economic, that's related to housing, to declining religiosity, to contraception, and to the availability of childcare. Now, Kurtz suggests, and again, I'm not 100% sold on this argument, but I think it's interesting that none of these really fit the macro data. Okay, so economics. The argument being, right, babies cost too much. Babies are expensive, right? Children are expensive. And you'll often hear figures thrown out that it's going to cost $1.2 million per child, right, to raise a child. And I don't have $1.2 million, and you don't have $1.2 million. So the conclusion is you shouldn't have children, right? And that's why people don't, because they know how expensive children are to have. So the declining fertility has to do with, principally cost of living, lack of economic incentives to have children. You don't get much in terms of, economic benefit the way you did when you had a family farm, right? You had a bunch of free workers. Today, as we all live in cities, having children ultimately is more costly than it is beneficial. So we continue to do it to the extent that we do as a sort of vanity project, right? You want to feel, and this is, Lisa Strawshine, who's in the department here as well. This is the argument she makes, right? If children are all kind of like a fashion accessory, it's all about self-fulfillment. I'm sorry to tell you, your parents, you're just self-fulfillment for your parents. No, I'm kidding. They don't really love you. It's all about their ego. No, that's not true. But if it's part of, a fulfilled adult life to have children, well, you don't need very many children to do that. And some people don't need any, so you're going to see, fertility kind of trail off. Now, Kurtz thinks that this probably is somewhat true, but actually doesn't tell the full story, right? And particularly this economics argument, he thinks doesn't work. And as evidence, what he cites is the fact that, if it's just a problem of economics, you should be able to intervene economically in order to raise the fertility rate. And there is a long history of governments realizing that population was a problem and trying to, use economic stimulus to convince people to have more children. Very famously, if you go back, and I will try not to go back to this too many more times in the course, to the Roman Empire, under Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Augustus realized that the Roman Empire had a population problem, so he essentially proposed what today you would probably call a land for babies scheme. Because wealth in Roman times was predicated on land ownership. So if you owned land, you were wealthy. And he was like, okay, look, if you have a third or fourth child, the empire will grant you a land title. And very famously, this land for babies scheme failed miserably. Now, we've gotten a better sense of economics since then, but our ability to generate babies with cash, that was a worse phraseology than I'd hoped, basically to economically induce people to have babies is no better. So very famously, lots of countries have tried these kinds of schemes. The Russian Federation has long had a population problem of which they are aware, and they've tried all sorts of schemes, right? Right after the post-Soviet collapse, a free refrigerator for women who had a second child. That didn't work, strangely enough. At one point, it was $10,000, per child after the second child. That didn't work, except in some regions where they were already having lots of children, like Chechnya. Eventually they raised it to $40,000. That didn't work. For every child past your second child, that didn't work either. As of today, Hungary, under its current Prime Minister Viktor Orban, have been undertaking this multi-year project to get Hungarian fertility up. Hungary is a very small country with a very kind of unique and insular culture. Their language is a little bit cuckoo pants, and they want to keep it that way, right? And so Orban has wanted to boost the birth rate, and they've tried all sorts of schemes. So they've done cash, right? Money straight into your bank account on the birth of your third child. That hasn't worked. And then more recently, they announced tax breaks. So women who have 3 or more children will never pay income tax. Well, I don't know. Hey, I have 3 kids. My wife still works. She still has income. She still pays income tax. But it's like you'll never pay income tax for the rest of your life. You'll never pay a cent of income tax, and that hasn't worked either, right? It hasn't boosted Hungary's fertility rate, which remains stubbornly stuck at 1.59 children per woman. And again, just to remind you, 2.1 is replacement fertility. So that is just keeping your population from declining. You need 2.1 children per woman. So Hungary remains really low. If you talk about other things, right, like the childcare argument or generous benefits, places like Sweden and Norway and I guess Finland are often listed as the best places on earth to have a baby because they have such generous maternity benefits. Oh, by the way, I should tell you this. In Russia, you have a full 2 years of paid maternity leave when you have a child, right? And guess what that's done for Russian fertility? Nothing. Absolutely, you're right, Mary Pierre. It has done absolutely nothing. So something else is going on, right? Countries like Sweden and Norway, right, have really generous parental benefits, right, which can be taken by either parent. They're considered great places to raise children. In Finland, when your child is born, they deliver you this little box with all sorts of things that are supposed to, help you through the first few weeks, including the box itself, which Finnish people use as a little bed for their tiny babies. Their babies sleep in a cardboard box when they're really little. It's a weird Finnish thing. They also leave their strollers outside on the street while they're having coffee in the cafes with the babies in them in the middle of winter. I know this, I've seen it, I thought it was weird, but it's apparently a whole Finnish thing. But they still have some of the lowest fertility on earth. So I think what Kurt suggests, I know what Kurt suggests, that these economic arguments don't seem to fully explain why fertility is low. Another kind of economics argument that I don't have on the slide here, but I'll just kind of narrate quickly, is that once you reach a certain level of kind of economic development, you will tend to see drops in fertility. And that level isn't actually very high. It's a GDP roughly equivalent to the GDP today of Indonesia, right? A GDP per capita, roughly where Indonesia is today. Indonesia doesn't have a tremendously high standard of living, but that's, according to a lot of people, that kind of standard of living tends to lead people to have fewer children. Kurtz also doesn't think this is right because in 1870, the richest country on earth, do you want to guess what it was? The richest country on earth in 1870? It's probably not the one you expect. Australia. And in 1870, Australia, which had the highest GDP per capita of any country, had a total fertility rate of 5.6 children per woman. Roughly the same as Nigeria today. So he says, there's something else going on. It doesn't seem to be purely an economics thing, because you can have really wealthy societies, and Australia at that point would have had a GDP per capita higher than what Indonesia has today, but still a really high birth rate. Okay, religiosity or lack thereof. Right? Okay, so the argument is that basically as countries have grown less religious, as the West has secularized, it's led to a decline in fertility, right? Because religious groups often have very particular rules around fertility, around, think of traditional Roman Catholics, where contraception is not permitted under any circumstances. See my friend Jared and his 11 children. And that, as religiosity has declined, so has fertility. And again, Kurtz doesn't think this is entirely wrong, but doesn't think it's entirely right either. Okay, so he says, outside of a few enclaves in the West, even the most religious groups, let's say American evangelicals, By the way, American evangelicals, I just saw numbers on this today, are more religious now than they were in the 1970s, right? They've actually gotten more religious. They go to religious services more often than they did in the 1970s. So they've actually gotten more religious, not less. So, yeah, outside of a few enclaves, even the most religious people, like our American evangelicals, barely hit replacement fertility, right? American evangelicals have a total fertility rate that's like 2.12, just barely above the replacement rate. Catholics is well below. Even weekly attending Catholics is well below. The only ones that really hit above are groups like Mormons. Mormons, I think it's about 3.1 for Mormons in the U.S. So they're well above, although their fertility has been dropping really quickly. The Amish, no technology, no birth control, I guess. And groups like really traditional Roman Catholics, right? These are the ones that they still go to Mass and expect to hear the Mass in Latin. So they're super traditional, and there's like 10 of them. Not actually, there's hundreds of them, but it's not a very big group. Okay, and of our 3 most religious countries in Europe, Romania, Moldova, and Greece, all of them have negative population growth, and pretty substantially negative. So, and I mean, Romania is very religious. Again, I was just looking at numbers on this a few months ago. Romania is like Saudi Arabia levels of religious, right? It's very, very religious. Weekly attendance in Romania remains very, very high, along with a bunch of other measures, and yet very negative fertility. So religiosity doesn't seem to correspond directly. Oh, other places that are, like Iran. Now, there's some debate as to how religious Iran actually is. I know it's dominated by a theocracy, which suggests very religious, but I know a lot of Iranians who tell me that Iranian people are not very religious. Iran has a total fertility rate of 1.58, so it looks a lot like Hungary. And it's, if we think of really high fertility, like Muslim countries, we're thinking Pakistan, Malaysia. I couldn't remember Malaysia. And some in Africa, though I'm forgetting which ones it is. Not the North African ones. Some Muslim countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. But most Muslim countries, especially as they reach higher levels of development, actually have declining fertility as well. And it's a small number of very, very religious, Afghanistan too, but Afghanistan's a whole different world in a lot of ways. So a very small group of super religious countries have very high fertility, though most countries are seeing declining fertility. Okay, you have no questions about this. Perfect. I love it. Okay, housing. This is the other one, right? Houses cost too much, right? This is the kind of argument. Housing has gotten much more expensive, and therefore, because people can't afford adequate housing or their kind of dream house, they don't buy children. You shouldn't buy children ever. You'll get in trouble with the law. They don't have children. So he's pretty glib about this one, but he suggests that even as home ownership for millennials has increased, about half of them owned a home by 2022, their childlessness rate had not decreased, right? So many millennials were still choosing to have very few children or no children at all. I picked the dumbest looking house I could for this slide. I don't know where this is, but I want to live there because it's a sort of nightmare house, I think. Okay. So obviously the other argument is birth control, right? That it's access to artificial contraception that leads to declines in fertility. Now, if you remember from the beginning of the course, right, we talked about this like early on in the course, that actually, from kind of the middle part of the 19th century onward, fertility had been declining. People were having fewer children. It was still well above replacement, but you can see it here on this graph, right? This is the baby boom in England and Wales, or in the United Kingdom. fertility had been dropping. What do we have there? 1800 on this chart. It goes, and then it crashes well before the invention of the birth control pill, which isn't till about here, right? So, fertility has been collapsing for a long time in the West, long before the advent of artificial contraception, which, right, in the US is approved in 1959, and then widely approved as contraception in 1961. In Canada, it's not till 1967. I don't know the date for England, but it's probably about the same time. So fertility collapsed well before the birth control pill. And sometimes we're fooled, right, by the fact that the boomers exist. That we had this massive demographic surge in the middle part of the 20th century, where we had a huge, and what did we hit? It was like 3.8 children per woman at the height of the baby boom, if I recall the numbers from the beginning of the course. But that actually seems to be kind of an aberration, right? A sort of weird, moment of cultural something or other, well, boinking, I guess, and having lots of babies in the middle part of the 20th century. But it actually is a kind of 20-year aberration. So, if the declines in fertility happened long before we ever got access to artificial contraception, then there has to be another proximate cause to why people have fewer kids today. And the reason I brought this in is because I think Kurtz suggests a really, really provocative, to me it's provocative thesis as to why, and he says that it's actually, a fundamental cause, which he says is status, which manifests itself in different places and times with a bunch of different proximate causes that might be economic, birth control, housing, or whatever. But actually, there's a bigger issue at heart. Okay, so what is status from our sociological perspective? So, status is really important, actually. Why? Because all of us are striving for status all the time, right? And this is something that Jonathan, when we get to the end of the course, Jonathan Haidt, I can write his name, will suggest is so toxic about social media is the status games that it kind of locks us into. We are, by all accounts from psychology, that little cousin of real disciplines, status comparison machines, right? We are really, really deeply, I'm sorry, I can't say psychology without taking a crack at psychology. It's just who I am now. And maybe I am trying to raise my own status by bringing down psychology. And it's working. I don't know. So we're status comparison machines, right? We are deeply attuned as animals, as human beings, to our social status within whatever groups we function in, right? So status, right, our perceived standing within the group, your place within the formal and informal hierarchies of which you are part. So a big motivator for most people is gaining status, right? Gaining status is a big motivation so that you can participate in society in a very high and productive kind of way where you get a lot of resources. And it is maintained through approved behaviors, achievements, etiquette, defending the group, whatever, through stuff you own, recognition of status symbols like title, wealth, important physical assets, right? Why does anybody buy an Audi? Because it's a physical asset that denotes a status, right? Why did a lot of the people I know who went into medical school go into medical school? Not because they wanted to help people. I knew them in junior high. They were basically sociopaths. It's not because they wanted to help people, it's because they wanted a really prestigious job, right? Okay, so what Kurtz suggests is this. I'm going to highlight it because highlighting is fun. The net status outcome of having a child is lower than the status outcomes of various competing undertakings. Especially for women, different colored highlighter. things like pursuing a successful career. So, as a consequence, different colored highlighter. Having children is deprioritized. I sometimes think that about 80% of the runtime of this class is me choosing different highlighter and pen colors. But I love it, and I'm not going to stop. Okay. So, what can we expect here? All right. So this is kind of another part of Kurtz's thesis. If the pursuit of status was indeed the primary causal factor in suppressing fertility, what would we expect to see? So, interventions which increase the status of parents increase fertility. So, if you do something to raise the status of those people who are parents, you should get them having more children. Communities in which parents are of higher status have higher fertility. High status individuals becoming parents causes others to follow suit. Social strivers, so the ones who want to raise their status, will forego children for higher status objectives. And those of secure status will have higher fertility. Plus this one, which I think I forgot to talk about on the slides, groups with unusual status systems have unusual fertility patterns. And I can make some notes about this as we go. Okay. Wait, there were no questions. Is the Slido even working? I'm going to say it is. Okay. So, he cites two examples about this, which are kind of interesting. Actually, he cites one. I pulled the other one from another study that I looked at, which he kind of talks about later, but whatever. I'll tell you about it anyway. So, the case of Georgia, and here I don't mean the one with peaches, I mean the small country in the North Caucasus, right? Just south of Russia, north of Chechnya, the country of Georgia. Its flag looks a lot like the British flag, except it has 4 little crosses on it instead of just red and white. So, Georgia's a weird place. Georgia has about 4 million people. All right, it's a really small country. It has its own really unique language and a unique alphabet, and Georgian is really cool. I cannot understand a word of it, but it's a really cool language. I've tried, just didn't go anywhere. It's a country that is Eastern Orthodox, so it's a Christian country, and a country where the church, especially following the Soviet period, plays a really prominent role. Okay. So, what happened in Georgia? Georgia, like most of the other post-Soviet states, had declining fertility. I don't have it on this slide. I pulled it up and I never posted it. It had declining fertility, somewhere around 1.68 children per woman, right? So, a declining population, and in a country where you only have 4 million people, and you're proud of your unique culture and heritage, and all of that, low fertility in a country with only 4 million people is bad, right? It means that your country, left to its own devices, is going to disappear rather quickly, and your culture, will be one of those cultures that's written about in the history books that disappeared. So, this was a big concern, and they tried the normal stuff, economics. But then a really kind of weird thing happened in the 2000s. Georgia's birth rate spiked by 28%. The number wasn't huge, right? It went from about 50,000 births a year to about 64 to 68,000 births a year. Small country. But it spiked their country from this to, at its peak, about 2.12 children per woman, where it has stayed since, right? It's still about that, so just above replacement fertility. And it has stayed there. And what appears to be the cause of this is this cat right here. This is Ilya II. He is the patriarch of the Georgian Orthodox Church. Now, the patriarch is kind of sort of like the Pope of one of these small Eastern Orthodox churches. If you're Eastern Orthodox, I know that's not exactly right, but just run with it. And so he's a really prominent figure, and he's kind of a big deal in Georgia. I don't want to say he's the Taylor Swift of Georgia, but he kind of is in some ways, right? And he announced, and I'm going to highlight this, that he would baptize and become the godfather to all third children and onward. So, if you had a third or fourth or fifth child, he would baptize them personally and become their godfather. And what happens, and this is pretty well documented, is there's an absolute boom in third children and fourth children. Now, it's in a relatively small group. There's a lot of people who still have 1 or 2 or 0 children, but the number of people having 3 and 4 children increases enough that it compensates for that lower fertility group and actually helps the whole population reach replacement fertility. So we get a lot. Now, why? So he's kind of a celebrity. And if you get him to be the godfather of your child, you're kind of connected to a celebrity, right? They kind of become like part of your family. And honestly, this would be like if Taylor Swift announced that she would become the godmother of every third child in, let's say in Canada. If Canadians had a third child, she would come to the baptism and she would officially sign on to be the godmother, right? So imagine how many people would be like, yeah, I want to say I know Taylor Swift, so I'm going to have that third child. So it's been widely understood as a religious phenomenon, but Kurtz, and I think this is correct, thinks of it as a status phenomenon. You want to be connected to a high status person, so you do the thing that connects you to that high status person. Also, people emulate celebrities, which is why, some people have suggested that if Taylor Swift ever gets married and starts having children, there's going to be a lot of 30-something women that end up having children as well. I'm not as convinced of that, but I think it's interesting. Mongolia. Okay, so Mongolia. Mongolia is also weird. So Mongolia has a lot of interesting qualities. And here, if I go back to point number 6, I will illustrate. So if we gave us an Audi, there wouldn't be any population issues. I'm going to go with yes. Okay. So Mongolia is also kind of, Mongolia fits this really well because Mongolia is a really weird place. Mongolia, for one, is really isolated. It's sort of stuck between Russian Siberia and China. So it's a pretty isolated country. It also has one of the lowest, so it has its own unique alphabet, which is sort of based on the Russian alphabet and sort of not. It kind of mixes like Asian and Cyrillic. It has the lowest percentage of people who speak English of any country in the Northern Hemisphere because the Soviets sort of controlled it and cut it off from the rest of the world, and so nobody ever learned to speak English. And so it has a really, really unique culture. Now, it also is kind of weird in that it also was suffering from really low fertility until about 20 years ago. And basically, its fertility in the last 20 years has been somewhere between 2 and 3 times higher than its neighbors. And as you see here, oops, you can't see because Mongolia is red and so is my pen. Just giving me an excuse to change pen colors again. Its fertility is 2.64. So, now, it's not because it's poor, right? It's about as wealthy as China, and Eastern Siberia. So it's about the same. It's also not a rural society. Rural societies do tend to have higher fertility, but Mongolia is highly urbanized, and it's not particularly religious. Its primary religion is non-religious because it was communist for a long time with a lot of Buddhism. But what seems to have made the difference in Mongolia is that each year, the president of Mongolia, whoever they are, gives an award, and I love the name of this award, the Order of Maternal Glory. Huh? Don't you want an Order of Maternal Glory? To each mother of 4, and also $60. big time money. So that there's a cash prize with the Order of Maternal Glory. Now, this is apparently a big deal. Each mother who has, so they do it by district in Mongolia. So the president travels to each district and they have like a kind of courthouse, and each mother gets to come down these long stairs, of these courthouses that have a statue of Genghis Khan in the back to meet the president, and he awards them the Order of Maternal Glory and presumably a big novelty check for $60. I actually don't know if that part's true. And it's a big deal, right? Like he's traveling to your city to give you an Order of Maternal Glory. And it's worked, right? So, do I have this on the next slide? Oh, yeah, let's talk about the opposite. Okay, the opposite. In South Korea, by the way, TFR in South Korea, as of 2023, 0.68. That's bad. That is a disappearing culture, much faster than the Georgians. Okay, so all the highest status people in, like all of the celebrities, like the Gangnam Style guy and all of the K-pop people, they're all childless, right? None of them have children. And the people who have the best jobs are often childless as well. Many high status people in the US are also childless. I don't know who that is. Okay, and lots of prominent Europeans, really powerful Europeans, are also childless. So Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz, the leaders of France and Germany, the two biggest economies in Europe, are also childless. And there was a point, a couple of years ago, it changed when Rishi Sunak lost in Britain, but the leaders of all the biggest and most important countries in Europe were all childless, right? So what's the argument here? Okay, so we have a couple of weird countries in Georgia and Mongolia where fertility is high and the status of parents that have a lot of kids is high. When you raise the status, you raise ultimately the fertility rate. So why then are we where we are? Okay, so next, you think your lives are bad. You should be a student in South Korea. Okay, so do social strivers have fewer children? That's another one of the arguments. So, again, we're in South Korea. I forgot to tell you that. Demand for education. Okay, so sorry. Actually, sorry, my South Korea example is just part of it. Okay, so think of people. Think of them. Think of them softly. No. When we think of education, right? Demand for education, especially college education, is at an all-time high. Even though, if you look at surveys of Americans and Canadians, fewer and fewer of them are convinced that the cost of education is necessarily going to be paid out by later economic achievement. This is especially true in the US. So, what do we see? Resource-limited parents, right, and we see this in surveys, would rather have fewer children who secure positions in an elite university like Harvard, Yale, Oxford. I want to be Mark Carney and go to Harvard and then Oxford. I fucking hate that guy. I don't know why. I don't like Mark Carney. He just rubs me the wrong way. But we went to the same high school. So maybe that's it. I'm jealous. He's more successful than me. Okay. So come at me, Mark Carney. Okay. Why? So why would people want to send their kid to a place like Oxford, Princeton, Yale? What Kurt suggests, and I think this is true, having a child at an elite university confers more status benefits than just having a child. Or having a child that is reasonably successful but went to community college, right? If your kid went to Harvard, how can you tell if someone went to Harvard? What's that? Yeah, you don't have to. They tell you. Right, that's the status game. Having someone who went to an elite university, whether they're more successful or not, confers status because you got to shake hands with future presidents or something. This poor South Korean kid. Okay, South Korea, TFR of 0.68 as of 2023, is a culture that deeply incentivizes people to take whatever measures necessary to ensure as high a social position. It's a very status-conscious society, and your status is very apparent to everyone around you. Now, the way that you get high status in South Korea is to work for what are called kaibals. They're these large, horizontally integrated corporations like Samsung, LG, Hyundai, Kia, companies that make a lot of stuff. Now, there are jobs in other places, but if you're going to be a really high status individual, you work at a kaibal. So, if you know anything about South Korea, is that the students there basically are in school all day and then they go to tutoring all evening, well into the night, often 15 hours a day or more of studying. That's why this kid says, "Kill me," right? They do not have a life. All with the goal of doing really well, of getting a top score in this national exam, right? Kind of like your PETs, your provincial achievement tests. Except imagine that the provincial achievement test, your score on it sets the rest of your life, right? Either you're going to be high status if you do really well, or you're going to meander through life. So the competition is absolutely fierce. And what the effect of this has been, parents who want their children to do well, basically spend all of their disposable income on extensive tutoring, right? Their kids are being tutored day and night to do well on these exams from a very young age, and most families are small. And it's so intense in South Korea, like the day of this exam, the airports all shut down. There's no air traffic into Korea for that day. They clear the roads, and the suicide rate spikes because there's a bunch of kids that know they're not going to do well, and they're going to end up working at, South Korean McDonald's, and they take their own lives, and it's really tragic. Okay, so social strivers have fewer children, as do those middle-class people who are trying to get their kids into Harvard. I'll take that as a compliment. I like that. The 4B movement. Yes, I have heard about the 4B movement. But it is bad. Okay. I can't remember what it stands for, but basically it's mostly women who are completely checking out of dating, marrying, and having children, right? For various reasons. And I can't remember why, but all right. Okay. I have 4 minutes to do like 94 slides. So, secure status people, established elites, do they have higher fertility? The ultra-rich definitely do. So in America, anyone making, with a family that has an average income of over $1 million a year, have a total fertility rate of about 2.15 children per woman, right? So it's above replacement. Now that said, below that into still the pretty wealthy range, those making just under $1 million to $500,000 a year, the TFR drops to 1.85. So it's still above our kind of average fertility, but still probably lower than they can afford. So there's probably something else going on. But definitely our most secure, right, here we're probably having so what Kurt suggests is that at this point, having an income over $1 million for your family suggests that you're so far beyond kind of basic economic necessity that what status becomes is not necessarily, having a great career. It's more like having well-bred kids that go to the top schools. Stuart, okay. Come on, Brian. like having great houses, right? Great vacation properties and all of those things. Okay. So, how many slides do I have left in 2 minutes? Many too many. Many too many. Okay. So, we'll start with a poll next time, I guess. All right, we can talk about status types. There's a few different status types that you can strive for. One is dominance, right? Where you basically beat the shit out of other people, and that's how you get status, right? This is you're the best warrior or hockey player, right? It's coerced by force or fear. I'm not going to say it, but Monsieur Trump. Virtue, right? Awarded for being conspicuously dutiful or observant or moralistic, right? Following the rules. And then success, right? You achieve particular outcomes. And and this is where I do think this is an interesting argument as well. In the pre-Enlightenment era, a woman derived status from her birth and virtue, right? So her birth was her social class, and virtue would be like virginity, piety, and motherhood. Why? Because status was conferred by the church. Once we hit the Enlightenment, we switch it up to meritocracy, right? The Enlightenment seeks to break down a lot of old social hierarchies, and so what we get is you get status by succeeding at things. Okay, and that's where we'll pick it up on. Is it Friday today? Friday. We'll pick it up on Friday. I want it to be Friday so bad. Okay. Okay. All right, we'll pick it up, and we'll keep going, and hopefully we'll finish talking about families at some point. Maybe not. The rest of the course is just this. All right. Ooh.